As soon as the ice sang in the morning, the medieval explorers followed in silence. The ice sang at dawn with a voice like crystal bells shattering in slow motion, and the moment Brother Thomas heard that ancient song, he knew their lives depended on understanding its meaning. He stood outside the expedition's rough shelter, his breath forming white clouds in air so cold it burned his lungs, and listened to the frozen sea speak in a language older than human words. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of creaks, groans, sighs, and those peculiar high notes that seemed to pierce straight through to the bone. Around him, 11 other men emerged from their makeshift camp, drawn by the same compelling symphony that had pulled Thomas from his restless sleep. They were medieval explorers from the monastery of St. Benedict, sent north by their abbot to chart unknown lands and establish contact with distant peoples, but they had found instead an endless white wilderness that tested every assumption they brought from their green homeland. Now, 3 months into their journey, standing on ice that stretched unbroken to every horizon, they faced a simple truth: learn the language of this frozen world or die trying. Brother Thomas was 35 years old, lean and strong from years of monastic labor, with sharp eyes that missed little and a mind trained in observation and logic. The abbot had chosen him to lead this expedition because Thomas possessed what others called uncommon wisdom, the ability to see patterns others missed, to adapt when circumstances demanded, and to make difficult decisions without losing himself in doubt. These qualities would be tested daily in the months ahead, as the expedition learned that survival in the Arctic required abandoning old certainties and embracing new knowledge with humility. The other men gathered around Thomas in the gray dawnlight, their faces showing the strain of weeks on the ice. Brother William was there, young at 22, but growing harder and wiser with each passing day. Brother Martin, the expedition's healer, stood wrapping his cloak tighter against the cold, his medical knowledge already proven invaluable. Brother James, the scribe, carefully protected his journal under layers of wool. He'd been recording everything, creating maps and observations that might guide future travelers. Brother Peter, built like a stone wall and twice as stubborn, served as their primary hunter and gatherer. And there were 7 others, each chosen for specific skills that the abbot had deemed necessary for surviving in unknown lands. They also had 2 guides, Harald, a weathered Norse sailor who'd ventured into northern waters for 40 years, and Eric, a younger hunter who claimed knowledge of ice travel. These men were not monks, not even truly Christian despite their nominal conversion before the journey began.
But their expertise was undeniable, and Thomas had learned quickly to trust their advice about the ice and its dangers. Would the guides' knowledge be enough to keep them alive, or had they traveled beyond even their experience? Harold stepped forward, his grizzled head tilted as he listened to the ice's morning song. His expression was serious, more concerned than Thomas had seen him in weeks. "The ice speaks of change," Harold said in his accented Latin. "That singing means the frozen sea is shifting, breaking, reforming. We need to move our camp away from pressure ridges and open water. Today." Thomas nodded, accepting the guide's judgment. They'd been camped in the same spot for 3 days, while Brother Martin treated several men for minor frostbite and exhaustion. The rest had been welcome, but if the ice was becoming unstable, they couldn't afford to stay. "How far do we need to move?" Thomas asked. Eric pointed northeast, toward a slight rise in the ice visible in the growing light. "Higher ground, where the ice is thick and old. Perhaps 3 miles from here." 3 miles didn't sound like much, but on the ice, pulling sledges loaded with supplies and equipment, it would take most of the day. Still, there was no choice. The expedition had learned that in the Arctic, you listened to those who understood the environment, or you paid for your arrogance with your life. "Break camp," Thomas ordered. "We move within the hour." The monks scattered to their tasks with the efficiency born of practice. They'd learned quickly during their journey, adapting from their monastery's ordered rhythms to the chaos and unpredictability of Arctic exploration. Shelters were dismantled, supplies packed onto 3 crude sledges they'd built from salvaged wood and leather straps. Everything had to be secured properly. A lost item in this environment could mean the difference between survival and death. As they worked, Thomas studied the ice around them. He'd been learning to read it the way Brother James read Latin texts, looking for meaning in its features and behaviors. The ice here was relatively flat, broken occasionally by ridges where sheets had collided and buckled upward. In some places, the pressure had created walls of ice fragments 20 feet high, jumbled chaos frozen in place. In others, the ice was smooth as glass, treacherous for walking but beautiful in its crystalline perfection. The singing continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never entirely stopping. Thomas had learned that the ice was never truly silent. It was always moving, adjusting, responding to currents and temperature and forces too vast for human comprehension. The monks had been terrified of these sounds at first, interpreting them as warnings or evil omens. But Harold and Eric had explained that the ice always sang, and the key was learning to distinguish between normal sounds and those that signaled real danger.
Was this morning's song normal, or were they in greater danger than even the guides realized? They set out across the ice in a line, pulling the sledges with rope harnesses around their shoulders. It was brutal work, even for men accustomed to physical labor. The sledges were heavy, the ice surface uneven, and every mile required constant effort. Thomas took his turn at the front, breaking trail, choosing the path that seemed most stable and level. Behind him came Brother Peter and several others pulling the first sledge, then the second, then the third, with Eric ranging ahead to scout and Harold bringing up the rear. The sun rose higher, though calling it sunrise was misleading. This far north, the sun no longer set completely during summer months. Instead, it circled the horizon in a continuous loop, creating a strange twilight world where time seemed to lose meaning. The monks had struggled with this endless daylight at first, unable to maintain their normal prayer schedules without the rhythm of day and night. Eventually, Thomas had established arbitrary periods for work and rest based on meals rather than solar position. As they traveled, Thomas noticed changes in the ice. They crossed areas where water had recently refrozen, the new ice thin and dark, requiring careful testing before they trusted it with their weight. They skirted open leads, cracks in the ice where dark water showed through like wounds in the white surface. These leads were both dangerous and valuable. Dangerous because falling through meant almost certain death in water so cold it would stop a man's heart within minutes. Valuable because they attracted seals, and the expedition desperately needed fresh meat. Brother William, walking beside Thomas, pointed to tracks in the snow. "Bear," he said quietly. Thomas had learned to recognize polar bear tracks, enormous paw prints that dwarfed those of any European bear. They'd seen bears 3 times during their journey, massive white ghosts moving across the ice with deceptive grace. Each time the expedition had made themselves loud and obvious, backing away slowly, giving the bear space. Harold had been adamant about this. Never run from a polar bear, never corner one, never come between a mother and cubs. The bears were lords of this frozen realm, and humans were just tolerated visitors. By midday, they reached the higher ice that Eric had indicated. The rise was subtle, perhaps 30 feet higher than the surrounding ice, but that elevation made a crucial difference. The ice here was older, thicker, more stable. Large blocks had been pushed together by ancient pressure events, creating a landscape of frozen chaos that nonetheless provided solid footing. In the lee of one massive ice block, they found a natural depression that would serve as shelter. Would this spot prove safe, or had they simply moved from one danger to another? The monks collapsed the moment Thomas called a halt, exhausted from the morning's labor. But there was no rest yet. Camp had to be established before anyone could truly relax. Brother Peter and Eric began erecting their tent, a simple structure of wool and leather stretched over a driftwood frame. Others unpacked supplies, organized equipment, prepared the fire pit they would use if they found enough fuel. Brother Martin moved among them, checking for injuries or signs of cold exposure. Thomas climbed to the highest point of their new camp and surveyed the surrounding ice. From this elevation, he could see for miles, an endless expanse of white, broken by pressure ridges and the occasional dark line of a lead. It was beautiful in its starkness, this frozen ocean, but also deeply alien. Thomas tried to imagine what this place looked like in winter, during the months of total darkness, and couldn't. Surviving summer here was hard enough. Winter would be... He didn't have words for what winter would be. Harold joined him on the high point. The old sailor gazed out at the ice with the expression of someone reading a familiar text. "We should turn back soon," he said without preamble. "Another month, perhaps 2, and we need to begin the journey south. The ice will break up as autumn comes. If we're still here when it does, we won't survive." Thomas had been thinking similar thoughts. They traveled north for 3 months, covering perhaps 200 miles from the last human settlement. The journey back would take at least as long, possibly longer if conditions deteriorated. If they wanted to reach safety before winter, they needed to start back soon. But Thomas also knew they hadn't accomplished their mission. They'd been sent to find new lands, to contact distant peoples, to expand human knowledge of the world. So far, they'd found only ice. "1 more week," Thomas said. "We push north for 1 more week. If we find nothing, no land, no people, no reason to continue, then we turn back." Harold nodded slowly, accepting the decision. Thomas appreciated that the guide didn't argue or question.
Harold understood that leaders had to lead, that decisions had to be made even when perfect information wasn't available. That evening, as the men gathered around their small fire, fueled by seal blubber they'd been saving, Thomas spoke about their situation. He believed in being honest with the men under his command, in treating them as partners rather than subordinates. "We're at a decision point," he told them. "The ice is becoming unstable. We're far from safety. Harold believes we should begin the return journey soon. I propose we continue north for 1 more week, then turn back regardless of what we find. I want your thoughts. Should they risk another week in this deadly environment, or play it safe and turn back now?" Brother James spoke first. "We've come so far. Another week might make the difference between returning with valuable knowledge or returning with only stories of ice." Others nodded agreement.
The expedition members had invested 3 months of hardship in this journey. The thought of turning back without finding something meaningful was painful. Brother Martin offered a different perspective. "We've already learned much about surviving in this environment. The maps James has made, the observations we've recorded, these have value. We don't need to find new land or new peoples to justify our journey." His words were reasonable, but Thomas could see the disappointment in faces around the fire. They'd come north with dreams of discovery, and ice alone wasn't enough to satisfy those dreams. Brother Peter said what several others were probably thinking. "1 more week won't kill us. We've survived 3 months. We can survive 7 more days." The statement was optimistic. 7 days could absolutely kill them if luck turned bad, but Thomas understood the sentiment. They were explorers. Caution was necessary, but too much caution meant never discovering anything. "We continue north for 7 days, Thomas decided. "Then we turn back, absolutely without exception. Agreed?" Everyone nodded, even Harold and Eric, though the guides looked less confident than the monks. That night, as Thomas lay in his sleeping furs pressed between other warm bodies, he wondered if he'd just made a fatal mistake. Leadership meant making choices with incomplete information, but it also meant living with the consequences of those choices. The ice sang through the night, its voice rising and falling like a strange lullaby. Thomas found himself listening to it, trying to understand its language. He'd learned that different sounds meant different things. Sharp cracks indicated ice breaking, deep groans suggested pressure building, high singing notes like they'd heard that morning meant the ice was adjusting to temperature changes. It was a complex vocabulary, and Thomas suspected humans would never fully understand it. But even partial understanding was better than ignorance. Morning brought clearer skies and slightly warmer temperatures, though warmer in the Arctic was relative, still well below freezing by any reasonable measure. They set out after a cold breakfast of dried fish and hard bread, moving north with renewed determination. The week of exploration had officially begun, and everyone seemed energized by having a definite timeline. 7 days to find something worth finding, then home. The ice that day was relatively smooth, allowing them to cover good distance. By evening, Thomas estimated they'd traveled 8 or 9 miles, the best single day of progress they'd made in weeks. Spirits were high as they made camp on another elevated ice section. Brother William even started humming an old hymn as he worked, something Thomas hadn't heard from anyone in the expedition for a month. But the second day brought their first serious challenge. They'd been traveling for perhaps 3 hours when Eric, who was scouting ahead, came running back with urgent news.
"Open water ahead. Large lead, very wide, blocks our path completely." The expedition hurried forward and found themselves facing a channel of dark water at least 300 yards across, stretching east and west as far as they could see. Could they cross this barrier, or had they reached the end of their northern progress? Harold studied the lead carefully, examining the ice on both sides, checking how it moved with currents and wind. "This is newly opened," he reported. "Yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, the ice split here. It might close again, or it might widen. No way to know." Thomas considered their options. They could wait and hope the lead closed, but that would burn through their 7 days without progress. They could try to go around, but the lead might extend for dozens of miles in either direction. Or they could attempt to cross. "Can we cross it?" Thomas asked. Eric shook his head doubtfully. 300 yards of open water, in water this cold? No one could swim that far. We'd need boats, and we don't have boats. The young hunter was right. Attempting to swim would be suicide. But Thomas's mind was working on the problem. "What about ice floes?" he asked. "Could we use floating pieces to bridge across?" Harold studied the lead again, looking at the chunks of ice floating in the dark water. "Possible," he said slowly. "Dangerous, but possible. We'd need to move quickly, jumping from floe to floe before they drift too far apart. One mistake, one missed jump, and whoever falls in dies. Everyone understands that?" His gaze swept the assembled monks, making sure they grasped the stakes. Thomas made his decision. "We try to cross, but we do it smart. Tie ropes to anyone crossing, so if they fall, we can pull them out. Send the lightest people first, have them pull supply lines across.
Take our time and do it right. The plan was risky, but Thomas believed it was less risky than the alternatives. Waiting could trap them on the wrong side if the lead widened. Going around could cost days they didn't have. They spent an hour preparing. Ropes were tied around waists. Equipment was redistributed to create lighter loads. The crossing route was scouted and planned. Brother William volunteered to go first. He was the youngest and lightest of the monks. Eric would go with him, guiding and advising. If those two made it across, others would follow in pairs until everyone was on the far side. Would their plan work, or was Thomas sending men to their deaths? Brother William and Eric stood at the lead's edge, roped together, with Brother Peter and several strong men holding the other end of the rope. The first ice floe was perhaps 6 feet from the edge, a flat piece maybe 10 feet across. William took a breath, said a quick prayer, and jumped. He landed easily on the floe, which barely rocked under his light weight. Eric followed, landing beside him. So far, so good. The second jump was harder, 8 feet to a smaller, more unstable floe.
William went first again, his leap carrying him across. The floe tilted alarmingly when he landed, nearly dumping him into the water, but he kept his balance. Eric's jump was better controlled, his greater experience showing. They moved quickly to the floe's far edge, preparing for the third jump. Thomas watched with his heart in his throat. This was the dangerous part, a series of smaller floes that required quick movement and perfect timing. William jumped, landed, jumped again, Eric right behind him. They were halfway across now, moving with increasing confidence. The watching monks began to relax slightly. This might actually work. Then disaster struck. William jumped to a floe that looked stable, but wasn't. It was a thin piece of refrozen ice that shattered under his weight. He fell through with a shocked cry, plunging into the dark water. The watching monks screamed and hauled on the rope. Eric lunged forward, grabbed William's arm, held him while others pulled. Within seconds, William was dragged back onto solid ice, gasping and shaking. But he was soaked, and the temperature was below freezing. They had perhaps 5 minutes before hypothermia became life-threatening, perhaps 10 before it became fatal. "Get him across, now," Thomas shouted. Eric didn't hesitate. He grabbed William and essentially dragged the younger monk across the remaining floes, moving with desperate speed. They reached the far side, and Brother Peter hauled them both onto the solid ice. Thomas made an instant decision. "Martin, you're next. William needs treatment immediately." Brother Martin jumped across the floes with surprising agility for a man of his age, reaching the far side in under a minute. Thomas could see him already stripping William's wet clothing, wrapping the young monk in dry furs. They were doing everything right, but would it be enough? Could they save William, or would this be their first death of the expedition? The rest of the crossing proceeded with extreme caution. Each person tested every floe before committing weight to it, avoided the thin ice, moved deliberately rather than quickly. It took 3 hours to get everyone and everything across, but they managed it without further incidents. On the far side, Thomas immediately checked on William. The young monk was alive but in bad shape. His skin was pale, his shivering violent and uncontrollable. Martin had him wrapped in every dry fur they could spare, had gotten warm liquid into him, had done everything possible. "He'll live," Martin reported, "but he needs warmth and rest. We can't move him for at least a day, maybe 2. Thomas nodded. So much for their 7-day timeline. Still, saving a life was worth the delay. They made camp on the north side of the lead, using their tent to create a sheltered space for William. The young monk's violent shivering gradually subsided over the next few hours, replaced by a more normal sleep.
Martin stayed with him constantly, monitoring for any signs of deterioration. The rest of the expedition huddled around their small blubber fire, processing what had happened. "I was too close," Brother James said quietly. "We nearly lost him." Thomas agreed, but tried to put positive spin on it. "We learned valuable lessons about ice floe crossings. That knowledge might save lives in the future." It was true, but it felt hollow. They'd been lucky. If Eric hadn't been so quick, if the rope hadn't held, if William hadn't been wearing heavier clothing that pulled him down, any number of factors could have turned near disaster into actual tragedy. Brother Peter asked the question they were all thinking. Do we continue north, or do we turn back? Thomas had been wrestling with exactly that question. William's accident argued for caution, for ending the exploration and returning to safety. But they'd only used 2 of their 7 days, and William would recover. Turning back now felt like giving up. "We give William 2 days to recover," Thomas decided. "If he's strong enough to travel after that, we continue north for the remaining 5 days. If he's not, we adjust our plans." It was a compromise, attempting to balance safety with the desire to complete their mission. Thomas hoped it was the right choice, but he honestly didn't know. William proved tougher than anyone expected. After 1 day of rest, he was sitting up and eating normally. After 2 days, he insisted he could walk. "I didn't come all this way to quit now," he told Thomas. "Let's keep going." Martin examined him carefully and declared him fit to continue, though he recommended taking the journey slowly to avoid overtaxing the young monk's recovering body. Had William truly recovered, or was he hiding continued weakness out of pride? So on the morning of the 5th day, they resumed their northern progress. William walked without his pack. Others divided the weight among themselves, but he walked steadily, showing no signs of lingering effects from his cold water immersion. Thomas kept a close eye on him throughout the day, ready to call a halt if William showed distress,
but the young monk kept pace without complaint. The ice they crossed that day was different from what they'd encountered before. It was older, thicker, covered in places with dirt and rocks that must have been picked up from land somewhere and deposited here by ancient ice movements. Harold examined these deposits with interest. "This ice has been against land recently," he said. "Maybe there's solid ground ahead. Maybe we'll find what we're looking for." The possibility energized everyone. They'd been traveling across empty ocean ice for so long that the thought of reaching actual land seemed almost fantastical. That evening, as they made camp, conversation was more animated than it had been in weeks.
People speculated about what they might find: new islands, unknown peoples, resources that could make the dangerous journey worthwhile. The sixth day brought confirmation of Harold's theory. As they traveled, the debris on the ice increased: more rocks, patches of dirt, even some scraggly vegetation trapped in the ice. And then, late in the afternoon, Eric shouted and pointed ahead. On the horizon, darker than the ice, was a shape that could only be land. The expedition hurried forward with renewed energy, forgetting exhaustion in their excitement. As they got closer, the shape resolved into a rocky shore, a place where the ice met solid ground. They had found land, actual terra firma, at the roof of the world. By evening, they stood on a beach of black stones, looking at a landscape of rock and snow and scattered hardy plants that somehow survived in this brutal climate. What mysteries did this unknown land hold, and what price would they pay to discover them? They made camp on the beach, grateful to be on solid ground after months on floating ice. The land rose steeply behind them into rocky hills, and beyond those, mountains were visible against the pale sky. There was no sign of trees. They were far beyond the tree line, but there was moss, lichen, small flowering plants growing in sheltered spots between rocks. Brother James immediately began collecting samples and making sketches, his excitement obvious. "Tomorrow we'll explore inland," Thomas announced. "See what this land contains. Maybe we'll find people, maybe not, but we've found new land, and that alone makes our journey worthwhile." The monks agreed enthusiastically. Even Harold and Eric, who'd been skeptical about the whole expedition, seemed pleased. They'd guided the monks to an unknown shore, had completed a remarkable journey of exploration. That night, sleeping on solid ground for the first time in months, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. They'd faced enormous challenges, had nearly lost Brother William, had pushed through doubt and fear and exhaustion, but they'd succeeded. They'd expanded the known world, had proven that humans could survive and even travel in conditions previously thought impossible. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new challenges, new knowledge, but tonight he allowed himself to simply enjoy the accomplishment. The ice sang its nightly song on the beach nearby, a familiar sound that had become almost comforting through familiarity. Thomas listened to it and thought about the journey ahead. They still had to return south, had to survive the trip back, had to make it home before winter closed the routes. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the accomplishment. Morning brought clear skies and the excitement of exploration. Thomas organized the expedition into two groups, one to explore inland, one to stay with supplies in camp. He'd lead the inland group, taking Brother William, Brother James, Eric, and 3 others. Brother Peter would remain with the camp, along with Harold, Brother Martin, and the rest. If anything happened to the exploration party, those at camp could at least try to return south with the news of this land's existence. They set out after breakfast, carrying minimal gear: weapons, water, some food, and James's sketching supplies. The inland terrain was rocky and steep, requiring careful climbing. But after months on the ice, where every direction looked the same, the variety was exhilarating. They saw rock formations, small valleys, frozen streams that must flow with snowmelt in whatever passed for summer here. Brother James sketched constantly, recording everything they encountered. Around midday, Brother William made a discovery. He'd climbed ahead to scout the route and suddenly called out with excitement. When Thomas and the others reached him, they found William standing beside unmistakable evidence of human presence: a circular ring of stones that must have been used as a dwelling foundation, fire-charred rocks, scraps of bone, and carved wood. Were the people who made this still nearby, or had this camp been abandoned long ago? Eric examined the site with expert eyes. "Old," he declared. "Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. People lived here but left. Maybe they come back seasonally." The evidence suggested a temporary camp used by nomadic hunters, similar to what the Norsemen used when hunting inland from their coastal settlements. But these remains showed different construction techniques, different tool types, evidence of a distinct culture. "There are people in these lands," Thomas said, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Not here now, but they exist. We're not the first humans to reach this place." The discovery was thrilling. They'd found evidence of an unknown people,
proof that humans could not just survive but thrive in this extreme environment. But it also raised questions. Who were these people? Would they be friendly or hostile? Would the expedition ever meet them? They spent an hour at the site, with James carefully documenting everything: the stone ring's dimensions, the fire pit's construction, the carved bones that showed remarkable artistry. Then they continued inland, hoping to find more evidence of habitation. The land rose steadily, and from higher elevation they could see more of this new terrain, a rocky island perhaps 20 miles across, surrounded by ice, with mountains in its center. On a ridge with a commanding view, they found another site, this one more substantial. There were multiple stone rings, evidence of a larger community, even some items left behind that suggested the abandonment had been recent, or even temporary. Eric examined everything carefully. "I think they use this as a seasonal hunting camp," he said. "They probably come when certain animals are here, then leave when hunting is poor. We might have just missed them."
The thought that they'd been so close to contact with these unknown people was both frustrating and fascinating. Thomas made a decision. "We'll leave a sign that we were here, something peaceful that shows we mean no harm." They arranged stones in a cross, a universal Christian symbol, but also a simple geometric shape that might be interpreted as a marker rather than a religious icon. Beside it, they left some trade goods, a metal knife, some glass beads, a piece of wool cloth. If people returned to this site, they'd know visitors had been here. Would these gifts be interpreted as friendly gestures, or would they cause confusion and fear? They returned to camp as evening approached, excited to share their discoveries. Brother Peter and the others listened eagerly to the description of the sites, examining the sketches James had made, discussing the implications. They'd found an unknown land inhabited by an unknown people, exactly the kind of discovery the abbot had hoped for. The expedition had justified its existence. But now came the hard part, the journey home. Thomas gathered everyone for a serious discussion. "We've accomplished our mission," he began. "We found new land, we've documented it, we found evidence of people living here. Now we need to get this information back home. That means starting the return journey tomorrow." He saw disappointment on some faces. Several monks wanted to stay longer, hoping to actually meet the inhabitants. But Thomas was firm. "We've used up our margin for safety. If we're going to make it back before winter, we leave tomorrow. That's not negotiable." Harold supported him immediately. "Thomas is right. We've been lucky so far. The ice has held, the weather has been mild, no one has died. But luck doesn't last forever. Every day we delay is another day closer to conditions we might not survive." His blunt assessment sobered the group. They'd all seen how dangerous this environment was, how quickly conditions could change from manageable to deadly. That final night on the new land, Thomas stood on the black stone beach looking out at the ice. Somewhere out there, 200 miles away, was the nearest human settlement they knew about. Between here and there was frozen ocean, pressure ridges, open leads, polar bears, and all the other hazards that had challenged them on the journey north. Could they make it back? The odds were better now. They'd learned so much about ice travel, about survival in the cold, about reading conditions and making smart decisions. But the odds were never good in the Arctic. The margin between life and death was always thin. Brother William joined him at the shore. The young monk had recovered completely from his cold water immersion, was perhaps even stronger for having survived it. "Do you think we'll make it home?" William asked quietly. Thomas considered lying, offering false reassurance. But these monks deserved honesty. "I think we have a good chance," he said. "We're smarter than we were. We've learned from Harold and Eric. We know what to expect. But there are no guarantees. The ice doesn't care about our plans or our knowledge. We might encounter conditions we can't survive." William nodded, accepting the answer. "I'm glad we came," he said after a moment. "Even knowing the risks, even after falling through the ice, I'm glad we made this journey. I've learned things about the world and about myself that I never would have discovered staying safe at the monastery." Thomas smiled. "I feel the same. This journey has changed us all. We've seen wonders, faced our fears, proven ourselves capable of more than we imagined. Whatever happens on the return journey, that's worth something." Would their accomplishment mean anything if they didn't survive to report it? The return journey began the next morning, under clear skies. They'd rested, had eaten well from their supplies and from seal meat Eric had hunted, and were as prepared as possible for the long walk south. The expedition left the rocky shore and stepped back onto the ice,
beginning the journey that would either bring them home as heroes or leave them as frozen monuments to human ambition. The first week went smoothly. The ice was stable, the weather remained mild, and they made good progress. They recrossed the wide lead, which had shifted position but was still manageable, without incident. They navigated pressure ridges with confidence born of experience. They hunted successfully, keeping their food supplies adequate. Everything suggested they might actually pull this off. Then, in the second week, they encountered their first major storm. They'd seen the weather building for a day, clouds massing on the horizon, the wind shifting, the ice singing a different, more urgent song. Harold recognized the signs and got them prepared. They built an emergency shelter, a low dome of packed snow blocks that Eric taught them to construct. They secured all their equipment, moved their supplies into the shelter, and settled in to wait out the storm. The blizzard hit with terrifying force. Wind screamed across the ice, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to zero. The temperature plummeted, and the wind chill made the cold feel deadly. Inside their snow shelter, the 12 men huddled together, sharing warmth, trying to remain calm. The shelter held, though they could hear the wind battering its walls, could feel the structure shuddering under the storm's assault. They stayed in the shelter for 3 days, only venturing out briefly to check conditions and relieve themselves. Food was rationed, water was melted from snow, and time passed with agonizing slowness. Brother Martin treated several cases of minor frostbite, fingers and toes that had been exposed during camp setup. Brother James worried about his journals getting damaged by condensation inside the shelter. Brother Peter grew increasingly claustrophobic in the confined space.
Would the storm trap them here until they froze or starved? Or would it pass in time? On the 4th day, the wind finally died down. They emerged from their shelter into a transformed world. Snow had drifted in massive piles, some more than 10 feet high. Their sledges were completely buried and had to be dug out. The ice showed new cracks and pressure ridges that hadn't been there before the storm. But they'd survived, and the weather was clearing. They spent half a day recovering their equipment and reorganizing their camp. Several items had been blown away by the wind and were never recovered. Some spare clothing, a cooking pot, various small tools. These losses were unfortunate, but not cataclysmic. They still had the essentials. What concerned Thomas more was time. The storm had cost them 3 days of travel, days they couldn't afford to lose. "We need to pick up the pace," he told the group. "Double our daily distance if possible. The storm put us behind schedule." The monks accepted the need without complaint, and for the next week they pushed hard. They walked longer days, took shorter rest periods, drove themselves to the edge of exhaustion. The effort paid off. They covered ground quickly, retracing their route south with increasing confidence. But the pace took a toll. Men stumbled with fatigue. Minor injuries became more common. Food consumption increased with the higher activity level, depleting their supplies faster than planned. Brother Martin voiced concern about sustainability. "We can push like this for maybe another week," he told Thomas privately. "After that, people will start breaking down. We're running on fumes already." Thomas knew Martin was right, but he also knew they didn't have much choice. Autumn was approaching, and with it would come worse weather, breakup of the ice, impassable conditions. They had to cover distance while they could, had to reach safety before the window closed. It was a brutal calculation. Risk exhaustion and injury now, or risk being caught on the ice when it became impassable. The next challenge came in their 4th week of return travel. They'd been making good progress across relatively smooth ice when suddenly Brother Peter, who was leading, fell through the surface. One moment he was walking, the next he'd crashed through thin ice and was up to his chest in freezing water. The monks behind him grabbed his arms before he could go completely under and hauled him back onto solid ice. Could they get Peter dried and warmed before hypothermia killed him, or had they run out of luck? Brother Martin took immediate charge, years of medical training kicking in. Peter's clothing was stripped off with efficient speed, dry furs wrapped around his shivering body, warm liquid forced between his chattering teeth. They built a fire using their precious seal blubber fuel, an extravagance they couldn't normally afford, but which was necessary to save Peter's life.
The big man sat as close to the flames as he could without burning himself, shaking violently as his body tried to generate heat. Unlike Brother William's immersion, which had happened in relatively warm weather, Peter had fallen through in significantly colder conditions. His recovery was slower, more uncertain. After an hour, he was still shivering uncontrollably, his speech slurred, his movements uncoordinated, all signs of serious hypothermia.
Martin worked on him tirelessly, but Thomas could see concern growing in the healer's eyes. They made camp where they were, unable to move until Peter's condition improved or deteriorated to its conclusion. That night was tense, with everyone gathered around Peter, willing him to survive. Brother James led prayers. Harold kept the fire burning. Eric stood watch for polar bears, knowing the light and smell might attract them. Thomas simply sat with his friend, holding Peter's hand, talking quietly about shared memories from the monastery. Morning brought improvement. Peter's shivering had eased, his speech cleared, his eyes focused properly. "I'm still here," he said with a weak smile. Martin examined him carefully and pronounced him stable, though weak. "He needs rest," Martin told Thomas, "at least 2 days before he should travel." Thomas felt the familiar squeeze of competing pressures. Peter needed time to recover, but they needed to keep moving. Once again, he had to balance safety with urgency. "We give him today and tomorrow," Thomas decided. "If he's strong enough to walk after that, we continue. We'll reduce his load, have others carry his pack, but we can't afford more than 2 days." It was harsh, but Arctic travel didn't allow for kindness. Peter would either recover enough to travel, or he'd have to be left behind. Thomas prayed it wouldn't come to that. Peter proved his toughness. After 2 days, he insisted he could walk, and he proved it by moving steadily when they resumed travel. He tired quickly and needed frequent rests, but he kept pace. Thomas redistributed Peter's equipment among the others, ensuring no one was overburdened. The group adjusted its rhythm to accommodate Peter's reduced capacity, and somehow they made it work. But the incidents with William and Peter made one thing clear. They were reaching their limits. 2 men had fallen through ice, 2 had nearly died from hypothermia, and they were still weeks from safety. Thomas increased vigilance, insisting that everyone test the ice carefully before trusting their weight to it, that they stay roped together when crossing suspicious areas, that they maintain constant awareness of conditions. The time for taking chances was over. From here on, every decision had to prioritize survival. Had their luck finally run out, or could they maintain their vigilance long enough to reach safety? The next 2 weeks were a blur of steady, grinding travel.
They walked, rested, walked again, day after day across ice that was beginning to show signs of autumn deterioration. Leads were more common. The ice was wetter, and in some places they could hear water flowing beneath the surface. Harold and Eric exchanged worried looks, but said nothing that would alarm the monks. Thomas noticed their concern and understood its cause. They were cutting it close, perhaps too close. One morning, Thomas woke to find the ice covered in a layer of fresh snow. Summer was definitely ending. The snow made walking treacherous, hiding cracks and weak spots. Their progress slowed as they had to be more careful about every step. But there was something else. The quality of light was changing. The sun was no longer circling the horizon at the same elevation. It was beginning to dip lower, creating longer shadows. Full darkness was returning to the Arctic, and darkness meant winter was coming. They were in a race now, trying to reach the last North settlement before ice conditions made further travel impossible. Harold estimated they were still 2 weeks away, maybe more. Every day counted. Thomas pushed them hard, knowing he was asking for more than the men had left to give, but seeing no alternative. They had to keep moving, had to cover distance, had to outrun the approaching winter. In their 7th week of return travel, they finally spotted a landmark they recognized, a distinctive mountain visible from the coast where the North settlement was located. Harold let out a whoop of joy, the first real emotion Thomas had heard from the usually stoic guide. "We're close," Harold shouted. "Maybe 3 days to the settlement. We're going to make it." The effect on the group was electric. Men who had been trudging along with dead eyes suddenly walked with energy. Conversation broke out for the first time in days. Even Brother James, who rarely showed emotion, was grinning. They were going to survive. After 4 months of Arctic travel, they were going to make it home. But fate had one more test for them. That night, as they made camp within sight of the mountain, a polar bear wandered into their camp. The huge animal appeared out of the darkness, drawn by the smell of their food. Eric saw it first and shouted a warning. Everyone scrambled awake, grabbing weapons, making themselves appear large and loud. The bear stood on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, studying these strange creatures that had invaded its realm. Would the bear attack, or could they scare it away without bloodshed? Harold and Eric knew the protocols. They shouted at the bear, waved their arms, made noise. The bear dropped to all fours but didn't leave. It circled the camp, testing their resolve. Thomas felt terror like he'd never known. They'd survived ice and storms and cold,
and now a bear might kill them within sight of salvation. Brother Peter readied his spear, prepared to fight if necessary. The bear circled again, coming closer.
Then, for reasons known only to itself, the bear turned and walked away. It disappeared into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving 12 men shaking with adrenaline and relief. No one slept the rest of that night. They kept a fire burning and maintained constant watch, but the bear didn't return. When morning came, they packed up and left that camp as quickly as possible. 3 days later, as Harold had predicted, they walked into the North Settlement. The residents came out in amazement, staring at these 12 men who had traveled to the top of the world and returned. The expedition members were gaunt, weathered, marked by frostbite and injury, but they were alive. All 12 of them had survived. They had gone into the unknown and come back, bringing knowledge and maps and stories that would influence exploration for generations. The settlement's headman provided them shelter and food. For the first time in 4 months, they slept in real beds, ate cooked vegetables, spoke with other people besides each other. It felt surreal, like waking from a dream. Brother William actually cried with relief. Brother Peter ate until he made himself sick. Brother James immediately began organizing his journals, preparing to make fair copies before the originals deteriorated further. Thomas sat with Harold and Eric, sharing ale and companionship. "Thank you," he said simply. "Without you, we'd all be dead. You kept us alive, taught us, guided us. We owe you everything." Harold shrugged, uncomfortable with emotion. "You weren't bad students," he said. "For soft monks, you learned fast. And you made good decisions, Thomas. You kept your people together when a weaker leader would have lost half of them." Eric added his own thoughts. "You respected the ice. That's what kept you alive. Many Southerners come north thinking they can conquer this land with courage and determination. But the ice can't be conquered. It can only be respected and survived. You understood that." Thomas appreciated the compliment from these 2 men whose respect he'd worked hard to earn. Could they complete the final leg of their journey, or would some new disaster strike before they reached the monastery? They remained at the settlement for 2 weeks, recovering their strength, preparing for the final journey south. The headman provided them with supplies and offered to send guides, but Harold and Eric volunteered to complete the mission. "We started this journey with you," Harold said. "We'll finish it." So in early autumn, the expedition set out on the last leg of their journey, traveling by boat along the coast and then overland through increasingly familiar territory. The landscape changed as they moved south. Ice gave way to tundra, tundra to scrub, scrub to the first real trees they'd seen in 6 months. The trees seemed miraculous, these tall, living things that grew from the earth and reached toward the sky. Brother William stood before the first pine tree they encountered and actually hugged it, laughing and crying at the same time. The others understood. After months in a world of ice and stone, life itself seemed precious and wonderful. They reached their monastery on a gray autumn morning, having been gone for 8 months. The abbot and remaining monks came out in astonishment. The expedition had been given up for dead months ago. Seeing these 12 men walk through the gates was like witnessing resurrection. The abbot embraced Thomas, tears running down his weathered face. "We thought we'd lost you," he kept repeating. "We thought you were gone." Thomas presented the abbot with Brother James's journals, detailed maps, careful observations, descriptions of ice travel techniques, accounts of the unknown land they'd discovered. "We succeeded," Thomas said quietly. "We found new land, we documented it, we learned how to survive in conditions we didn't think humans could endure. We've expanded the known world." The abbot took the journals reverently, understanding their value. Over the following days, the expedition members were debriefed extensively. They described their journey in detail, the initial travels across the ice, learning from Harold and Eric, the storm, the crossings of open leads, the near deaths of William and Peter, the polar bear encounter, everything. They shared the techniques they'd learned for ice travel, for building snow shelters, for hunting seals, for reading weather and ice conditions. They described the unknown land and the evidence of its mysterious inhabitants. The monks had changed. That much was obvious to everyone at the monastery. They moved differently, carried themselves with a confidence born of survival. They had difficulty adjusting to monastic routine after months of Arctic survival,
found the cloistered life confining after experiencing vast open spaces. Several, including Brother William, requested permission to return north on future expeditions. The abbot was non-committal, but recognized that these men had become specialists in a type of exploration the church was increasingly interested in. Brother Martin became the monastery's chief healer, incorporating techniques he'd learned into his practice. Brother James's maps were copied and sent to other monasteries and eventually to royal courts, influencing future exploration. Brother Peter trained younger monks in survival skills, preparing them for difficult journeys. And Thomas was appointed Master of Expeditions, tasked with organizing and leading future explorations to unknown lands. Had the expedition been worth the risk, or had they simply been lucky to survive their foolishness? Thomas wrestled with that question for years. They'd lost no one, an almost miraculous outcome for such a dangerous journey. But they'd come close to deaths multiple times. A few different decisions, a bit worse luck, and they could have all perished.
Still, they'd accomplished their mission and expanded human knowledge. The maps they'd made, the techniques they'd documented, the land they'd discovered, these had lasting value. 5 years after the first expedition, Thomas led a second journey north. This time they were better prepared, better equipped, and had more realistic expectations. They returned to the land they discovered, and this time encountered its inhabitants, a people they came to know as the Inuit, masters of Arctic survival with centuries of accumulated wisdom. Thomas established friendly relations, learned from them, traded with them, and returned with even more valuable knowledge. The encounter sparked a gradual shift in how European explorers approached unknown peoples. Instead of assuming superiority and seeking to conquer or convert, some began to approach with humility, ready to learn from those who understood their environments. It wasn't a universal shift. Many explorers remained arrogant and destructive, but the example set by Thomas's expeditions influenced enough people to make a difference. Brother William made that second journey and 3 more after it. He became the monastery's greatest expert on northern peoples and Arctic survival. He wrote extensively about his experiences, creating texts that were studied by explorers for generations. His writings emphasized respect for indigenous knowledge, the value of cultural exchange, and the idea that survival in extreme environments required learning from those already adapted to them. Brother James's maps were used by explorers for decades. As more expeditions traveled north, they added details to his original charts, correcting errors and filling gaps, but his foundational work remained essential. Modern historians still reference his journals when studying early Arctic exploration. His meticulous documentation set a standard for how expeditions should record their findings. Brother Peter never fully recovered from his immersion in the icy water. His health was compromised, and he died at age 52, relatively young for a monk. But he lived 12 years beyond the expedition, years he spent training others and sharing his knowledge. When he died, over 100 people attended his funeral. Monks he'd trained, friends he'd made, people whose lives he'd touched through his teaching. Brother Martin lived to be 78, one of the monastery's longest-lived members. He continued practicing and teaching medicine until the end, incorporating techniques from various cultures into a comprehensive approach to healing. Many credited him with saving their lives through his treatments. When he finally passed, the monastery lost one of its greatest healers, but his students carried on his work. Harold and Eric never made another Arctic journey. They'd earned enough from guiding the expeditions to retire comfortably. Harold died at sea during a routine trading voyage when Thomas was 53. Thomas attended the funeral and spoke about the old guide's courage and skill, about how Harold had kept 12 monks alive through conditions that should have killed them. Eric lived to be 70, dying peacefully in his home, surrounded by family. Thomas himself lived to be 68, still vigorous almost until the end. He led 5 Arctic expeditions in total, each building on what previous ones had learned. He established trade relationships with northern peoples, created a body of knowledge about Arctic survival, and influenced a generation of explorers. When he finally grew too old for difficult travel, he focused on teaching, ensuring that younger monks would carry on the work. On his deathbed, surrounded by friends and former expedition members, Thomas reflected on his life. He thought about that first journey, about the sound of the ice singing in the morning, about following that call in silence with 11 other men. He thought about the friends he'd made, the places he'd seen, the things he'd learned. He thought about near deaths and narrow escapes, about terror and triumph, about transformation through trial. Was it worth it? Someone asked him, repeating the question that had followed him for 40 years.
Thomas smiled. "Every frozen mile," he said. "Every moment of fear, every brush with death, every lesson learned. It was all worth it. We went into the unknown as ignorant men. We returned as students who had learned from greater teachers than ourselves. That transformation, that humility, that respect for knowledge wherever it's found, that was worth any price." He died that night, peacefully, having lived a full and remarkable life. His funeral was attended by hundreds, monks from his own monastery and many others, explorers he'd trained or advised, scholars who'd studied his work, and even representatives from northern peoples he'd befriended. They all came to honor a man who had ventured into the harshest environment on earth and returned not as a conqueror, but as an ambassador of understanding. The monastery erected a monument to Thomas and his expeditions, a simple stone marker that showed a map of the Arctic coast and bore an inscription. As soon as the ice sang in the morning, the medieval explorers followed in silence. It was a reminder that the greatest journeys often begin with listening, with paying attention to the world around us, with following calls we don't yet understand, toward destinations we can't yet imagine. The ice still sings its morning song, up there in the Arctic where humans are visitors rather than masters. It sings of change and constancy, of danger and beauty, of the vast indifference of nature, and the tiny persistent courage of humans who venture into its realm. And sometimes, if you're quiet and patient and respectful, you can hear in that song an invitation to explore, to learn, to be transformed by what you discover. Thomas's legacy lived on in many forms. His maps guided countless explorers.
His writings influenced attitudes toward indigenous peoples. His example showed that successful exploration required humility and learning rather than arrogance and conquest. But perhaps his greatest legacy was simpler. He proved that ordinary people, when facing extraordinary challenges, could rise to meet them through courage, cooperation, and a willingness to learn. The 12 monks who followed the ice's morning song became legends in their own right, their story told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the core truth that they had gone far beyond the known world and returned transformed. Each man's life was changed by the journey. Some became teachers, some explorers, some healers, but all carried with them the knowledge that humans are capable of adapting to conditions that seem impossible, of surviving where they shouldn't, of learning from anyone willing to teach. And somewhere in the Arctic, the ice continues its eternal song, singing to those brave or foolish enough to listen, calling them to venture beyond the comfortable and known, promising nothing but hardship, and offering in return the chance to discover what they're truly capable of becoming. It's a call that some will always answer, following in silence as medieval explorers once did, walking into the white unknown with hope and determination, and the knowledge that the journey itself will be the teacher. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey across the frozen north with Brother Thomas and his fellow monks. If this story of exploration, survival, and transformation moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of human endurance and discovery. We share stories of historical expeditions, of survival in impossible conditions, of the courage to venture into the unknown, and the wisdom to learn from what you find there. Hit that subscribe button and continue exploring with us the vast and inspiring story of human perseverance. Until next time, may you listen for your own morning song. May you follow it with courage, and may your journeys transform you in ways you never imagined possible.